Hello and welcome to another Python tutorial. So in today's video, we are going to cover, I think, an interesting topic to say the least. We're going to see how we can create, I guess one way to describe Python formulas that we can use in an Excel spreadsheet. So the goal of this is to see how we can create an object, a Python object really, and then being able to run that Python function from within inside of an Excel workbook, but then treat the methods of that object as formulas. And so just some as examples of kind of things that we're going to build today. Here are two of the three formulas that we're going to build. So the first one is simply going to add an array of values. So again, we're going to keep it simple. I want to do kind of examples just to kind of get us into the topic, and then we'll go into the more customizable ones that we can do within Python. So all this one is doing, it is simply adding an array of values. And then this one is our Python sum formula. This is simply adding two cells. And then there's going to be a third one where we're going to multiply two different cell values. So those are the three functions that we're going to create today. But this is kind of our introduction to this topic. And so we'll start out with some of these more simple examples, and then we'll go into ones that really use Python to its full extent. So things where we can do like API formulas, for example, or ones that maybe leverage some machine learning libraries and things like that. Things where trying to calculate in Excel might not make a lot of sense. So with that being said, I'm going to close out my workbook really quickly. And then I'm going to go into Visual Studios, and we will start chugging away. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to import our libraries, just like always. The first one is going to be called Pythoncom. This one will make a little bit more sense when we actually start writing the code, but basically it's going to help us create an ID for our object. And then the next one is going to be NumPy, and this one will have an alias, and we'll call that alias MP. And then the final one is our favorite wonderful little library. It is the client object that belongs to our Win32 API. So those are the three libraries that we need in order to run our Python object. And then from here, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a class object. So a class object is basically an object within Python. And then we'll call this one our Python object library. And then we'll put our colon. Not going to go into too much details about object-oriented programming and objects and program languages, but at this point we just need to know that objects have things called methods and properties. The methods are the things the object can do. So for example, if I had an Excel workbook, I can save that particular Excel workbook. That would be a method, but the properties describe our objects. So for example, when we're using a slide object, we would say, hey, what is the height of our slide? The height is a property. It's basically like an attribute of our particular object. And so that's kind of our intro to object-oriented programming. But basically what we're doing is we're going to create an object in Python, and we're going to give these objects methods. And those methods are going to be the formulas that we're going to be using in our Excel spreadsheet. But in order to actually register our objects, so that way VBA can see the information that is we're basically typing away and then eventually storing in some kind of file, we have to register it with the Windows API. And so there's a couple of different components that we have to define about our particular object, so that way Windows can actually store it and register it in its system. So that way when we go and try to create our object, it knows what we're actually asking for. Now the first component of our particular object is going to be called underscore reg underscore CLS ID and then underscore. And then this one will equal the Pythoncom, and then we're going to call the create GUID function. And what this will do is it will create a GUID or CLS ID. Sometimes they're interchangeable, but basically this is a unique ID that will belong to our object library. And so this is something, if you went into the Windows registry system, this would be the ID that is associated with our particular object. Now it's a very long number. It's not very user, I would say, friendly, but it is unique. And so this is something that is unique to every single basically object that we kind of register with the Windows API. Now, instead of basically having to go out there and create our own, we're just going to call the create GUID function that belongs to this library, and that will create the GUID for us. And then what it will do is then we can use that as an ID. And kind of to demonstrate that is if I actually print it out, hopefully it will give you an idea of kind of what it's going to look like. It's again, it's a long number, so it's not necessarily the where is it? Oh, I'm sorry. These should be lowercase. GUID, and then we'll run it again. Okay, so as you can see here, this is our GUID that was generated for this particular run through. And so every time we run it, if we run it again, I'm pretty sure it's going to be different. It's thinking, yeah, so this one's different than the last one. So that's basically what it's doing, is it's creating an ID that's going to be associated with our object library. And then if we wanted to later down the road, if we wanted to reference this library, we could use the GUID if we wanted to. There's other ways we could do it, but this is kind of the more unique way. So this will create a GUID to register it with Windows. Windows. It is unique, so you should always have a GUID that is unique. You shouldn't be reusing your GUID. Okay, and then the next one is going to be called _reg_CLS, and then CTX, and then underscore again. And then for this one, we're going to go again into our Pythoncom library, and then we're going to go CLS, CTX, and then local underscore server. Let me make sure I spelled that right. CLS, CTX, local, and server. And so there's two options that we could use with this one. Is the first one is local server, and then the other one is inproc server. If we register it as an inproc server, it will be a DLL file. Whereas if we choose a local server, it will be an exe file. Now, in our example, we want it to be an exe file, and then that is actually the default. Even if we don't specify this parameter, by default, it will create it as an exe file. In some cases, we do want a DLL file, but in this example, we do want an exe file. So what this one is going to be doing is it registers the object as an exe file. The alternative is a DLL file. And then that one, if you wanted to, it would be inproc server. There we go. So now that we've done that, we're going to register a program ID. This is basically our more, I would call it user-friendly ID, that if somebody was going to go and create this object, this is more than likely the method they would be using. And so again, it's _reg_ and then it's prog ID _. And in this one, we can just pass through a string, and we'll call this one python.objectLibrary. And so if we want to go and create this object in VBA, more than likely we're going to be using this method because this is the more user-friendly one. A lot of times the GUI ID is behind the scenes. It's not very much accessible unless we kind of go purposely look for it. So normally if we're going to create that object, if we're going to reference this object in the Win32com library, we would more than likely be doing this method just because, more user-friendly, it's easier to understand and all stuff like that. So this is the program ID. We can think of this as this is the name of our object library in a sense. So it's basically the name of our object. And then we will use this to create the object in VBA. Okay, so now that we've done that, we have two more. The next one, this is an optional one if you want. It's reg_descript, and basically this is a description of our library. So this is our Python object library. So you don't have to pass this through, but if you want a description that goes along with your library, this is how it would look. This is a description of our library. Okay, so also keep in mind, please make sure that these underscores are after them. I made this mistake before. You have to make sure you put the underscores after or else it won't run correctly. Okay, and so now comes kind of the probably most important part, at least I like to think of it. We have the public methods. And so these are the methods of our objects that we want to be public, or in other words, usable to a user. And really all it is a string. Sorry, not a string, it is a list of strings. And so all we're going to do is we're going to put through a list of all the methods that we want to be available to the user. And one of them will be called Pythoncom. The next one will be called Python multiply. And then the other one will be called add array. It's very important that these names match the methods that are down below, or else you're basically referencing something that doesn't exist. And so what this will do is it will make sure that it basically tells the object library in a sense that these are the methods that we want the user to be able to use. So if they're not in this list, it is assumed that you want those methods private. So it's very important to keep in mind, if it's not in this list, it's assumed that you want them private. So a list of strings that indicate the public methods for the object. And then if they aren't listed, they are considered private. In other words, we can't access them from our particular VBA window, if you want to think about it. Okay, and then from here, now we can actually define the methods that belong to our particular object. But really, this is kind of what I would call the paperwork behind the scenes. We've got to pass through an ID. We've got to specify what type of file we want it to be. We have to define the program ID that belongs to our library, an optional description if we want one, and then the public methods that we want available. Now there's more parameters that potentially we can pass through, but at this point, this is really all kind of what we need to kind of get the bare bones working system good to go. Okay, so from here, we're going to define our first one. It's going to be called Pythoncom. And again, I'm making sure that it is spelled exactly the same that we're seeing here, because otherwise it will not work. And then so for this one, it's going to take the object itself, and then it's going to be X and Y. So it's going to take two parameters, X and Y. And what we're going to do is we're going to return X plus Y. So the sum of those two individual parameters. So we're going to say return the sum of two values. The next one is going to be called Python multiply. Again, same as here. And if you want to just be extra safe, what you can do is you can always just kind of copy it, because this is sometimes where I make this mistake all the time, where it's like I'm using it and then it's like I screw up the name or something like that, and then before I know it, it's no longer working. I'm like, why? Okay, so this one will again take the object itself, and then it will be, we'll do A times B or something like that, just to keep it a little bit different. And then again, this one will return, in this case, return the product of A times B, so two cell values. And so this will return the product of two values. Okay, and then the final one is going to be called add array. And then this one will take the object itself, and then it will take a parameter called my range. And so this, we have to keep in mind, when we use this formula inside of the Excel spreadsheet, what is really being passed through is a range object. It's very important to keep that in mind. It is not a range of values, it is a range object. And what we have to do is go fetch that object, and then once we've fetched the object, we can start manipulating it. So the first part is create an instance of the range object passed through. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set that equal to a variable called range1. And then we're going to go into the Win32 client. We're going to call the dispatch. And then from here, we're going to pass through that parameter, that ranged object. And then from here, now we can kind of treat it like we've done in previous videos. We can get the values, we can take those values and put them in a list, and then we'll convert that list to a NumPy array. And so We'll create another variable called range value. This will equal numpy array, and then we're going to pass through a list, and then we're going to go into range 1, and we'll call the value property. Keep in mind it needs to be a capital V. And so what this is doing is we're going to take the values, which is a tuple, so a tuple within a tuple. We're going to convert that to a list of tuples, and then we're going to convert that list of tuples into a numpy array. And then from here, we're going to return range 1 values, which is a numpy array, and we're going to call the sum method. So we'll say convert the range into a numpy array, and then this one is return the sum of that numpy array. Okay, and so this one is adding a range of values. Perfect. So we've now defined our object. We've got the paperwork. We've got the formulas. Let's register our object inside of Windows. So we're going to say if underscore name underscore equals, and then underscore main. And then from here, what we're going to do, oh, and sorry, it's double equal, my apologies. And then from here, what we're going to do is we're going to import the win32com.server.register. So this is how we're going to register our object with Windows. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take this, and then we're going to say use, oh geez, if I can type today, use command line. And then from here, what we're going to do is we're going to pass through the object itself. So we're going to pass through this class object, and this will register it with our wonderful object library. And so once we do this, we can run it. This will come up, it will prompt you. You can simply go yes. And then this nice little note will come down at the bottom. It's going to say registered Python object library. So we're good to go. We can now jump into an Excel workbook. And so that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to open up Excel. And then from here, I can, well, first thing I'll do is I'll just put some cell values, right? 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. I'm going to go into my developer tab. I'm going to go into Visual Basic. And you can see my messy personal macro workbook. I've got too much in there. I need to get rid of some of those. I'm going to insert a module. We'll take off option explicit for right now. And then what we're going to do is we're going to define some functions. And so basically what we're doing is we're going to create these functions, and then these functions are in a sense going to go create that object library, call one of the methods, and then pass through the parameters that we specify in our particular function. So the first one is going to be called Python. We'll do some lowercase Python sum, x as long, and then y as long. It's very important that we denote the data type that is being passed through, because otherwise it will just assume it is a range object. So it's very important to note what the data type is, or else it's just going to go to the default one. Okay, and then from here, we're going to say Python sum, this formula will return, go into VBA, we're going to go into create object, we're going to create our Python.object library, and then we're going to go into the Python sum method, and then we're going to pass through x and y. Okay, let's see how this one works out. So what we'll see here is if I go here and I say Python sum, I can now see my formula. I can now pass through individual ones. And now I have simply added those two cells. So again, if I go here, I do 4, 5, I should get back 9. So I do want to demonstrate, because again, it will throw people off when they first do it. Let me put this as that and see what happens. See how you get a pound value now? Because technically what you are passing through is a range object and another range object. And so that's confusing the Python code. It's expecting these numbers, but now you've given it an actual object. And if we don't actually define that these numbers that we're passing through are numbers, then this is going to throw it off. And so once we turn this back over here and then we run it again, it works fine. But if we didn't do that, it would have thrown it all off. So it's very, 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 very important that you know what you're supposed to be passing through for each individual function. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one. And then again, this one would actually, again, take two parameters, x and y. But this one is multiply. And then we'll copy that. Copy. Bum, bum, bum. Bum, bum, bum. And then perfect, Python multiply. And then if I go over here, I can say, hey, take the product. Oh, sorry, well, I should definitely do Python multiply. I can take the product. It's like jumping ahead today, I swear. And now it will take the product of those two cells, so a B7 and a B6. And again, I have to specify the data type. Okay, for our last one, function add array. The cool one, right? Nah, I don't know. This one will take one parameter. It should be a range object. So in this case, it's okay to pass that through. I'm going to say add array. And again, VBA dot create object. The Python dot object library, and then we're going to say add array, and then this one will take one parameter x, and then so this one will say add array. I can select that entire range of cells, and I see that the sum of that cell, of those cells, is simply all of that. Now it threw it off a little bit. There we go, so 35. So it's very cool. I think that's pretty interesting when you look at it. I'm gonna have to kind of keep exploring it a little bit, just because, a lot of it is we have to understand kind of what is being sent back to us. And so sometimes data types can get screwed up or things along that nature. So it might not just be a necessarily like it was before, and you just take a range of cells and it just works smoothly for some reason. So we do have to kind of check this stuff. I'm going to have to kind of keep exploring. A lot of it is testing it, seeing what works, what doesn't work, understanding what's being passed through, what's not being passed through, and things along that nature. But with that being said, we are now finished with our video. So if you have any questions about the topic that we covered today, please make sure to put them down in the comments below. I want to kind of get your guys' feedback on this. Do we think this is kind of the right direction to go? Do we think that there's opportunity with this? Obviously with things like adding and doing stuff like that, it doesn't make a lot of sense to create a whole Python formula for that. It just really doesn't. But I think for some of the more complicated stuff, so things like doing like an API call, doing things like maybe leveraging certain built-in libraries to kind of do more complicated calculations, that might make a little bit more sense. There might be a kind of a chance to kind of optimize what we're doing in those situations. So I'm kind of curious to see what your guys' thoughts are on this topic. Also, if you could make sure to like the video and share it. I think this is a good video for other people to see. Hopefully it kind of sparks some creativity out there and let them see, hey, what can we now potentially do with all of this? And then which kind of direction can we take? And then also, if you're not already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you get regular updates as we release new videos. So we're going to obviously cover this topic in more depth. I am creating a Win32 library. We're going to talk about, I think in the first one, early versus late binding. So just creating our objects, being able to understand kind of what we're working with inside of Python. It's going to be very useful. And then we're going to see how we can actually leverage the constants that we were using inside of VBA, inside of Python. So that was something I wasn't even aware of until I started doing some research, but we can actually leverage the same constants that we were using inside of VBA. We can leverage them inside of Python. So in other words, we don't have to remember all the numbers for the parameters that we have to pass through. So very interesting stuff. So thanks again for watching, guys. We will see you in the next video. Thanks again.